right, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Christian Emden. I'm the chair of the Department of Modern and Classical Literatures and Cultures, and also one of the founding directors of the program in Politics, Law, and Social Thought. It's a great pleasure to welcome everyone here. Before I hand over to Scott McGill to introduce today's esteemed speaker, I should point out that today's talk is co-sponsored by both the department and the program in Politics, Law, and Social Thought. The program is a collaborative venture between the School of Humanities and the School of Social Sciences, and I'm very grateful for the support by both deans over the years and into the future. I should also like to point out that classical studies, which is an integral part of modern and classical literatures and cultures, has a very close relationship to politics, law, and social thought. Harvey Yunis' core course on Athenian democracy is a core course for our program as well. And so it's a super great pleasure that we can also have today's speaker relating both to the contemporary American situation and to the Roman Republic, and of course, whether, how, and whether at all we can learn from the fall of the Roman Republic. And I'm going to hand over to Scott McGill, the newly minted Deedee McMurtry Professor of Classical Studies.
Great, thanks, Christian, and welcome to everyone. So it is my pleasure today to introduce Edward Watts. Ed is Alcibiades Vasiliadis Chair of History at University of California, San Diego. He is the author of 6 books, most recently, The Eternal Decline and Fall of Rome, The History of a Dangerous Idea, published in August of this year with Oxford University Press. His books have won numerous prizes, and they have become standard works in the field of ancient history. Ed is perhaps now best known for his Mortal Republic, How Rome Fell into Tyranny, published with Basic Books in 2018. The book was written for a wider readership beyond academia, and it is one of the rare titles to have succeeded in that mission, garnering a broad audience as well as reviews in the New York Times, The Economist, and Vox, among other venues. In addition, Ed is the co-author of 5 volumes, including most recently Blackwell's Companion to Late Antique Literature, published in 2018. Not coincidentally, he also has a lucrative endorsement deal with Red Bull. I'm kidding, but still wonder where he gets the energy to produce all the work he does. I have to say that it's a particular pleasure for me to have Ed at Rice today, or at least in the Rice Zoomosphere. Ed and I have known each other since graduate school in the 1990s, and we have together edited 2 of the volumes mentioned earlier. I know at firsthand what an excellent scholar he is, and how compellingly he thinks about ancient Rome, and especially late antiquity, the period of Rome's so-called decline and fall. But there are really 2 declines and falls of Rome. One in the 5th and 6th century CE, when supposedly large flaxen-haired barbarians overran a decadent, exhausted empire, and one in the 1st century BCE, when a rotted Roman Republic fell and gave way to the rule of the emperors of Rome. It is this first fall, that of the Republic, that interests Ed today. Let me now hand things over to him.
Thank you, everybody. I want to thank, I'm going to share my screen while I'm talking, but I want to thank everybody at Rice for putting this together, and especially the program in Politics, Law, and Social Thought for organizing this, and Scott especially for welcoming me and introducing me. I think the comment about Red Bull was somewhat facetious, but I think the energy comes from working with really great colleagues and collaborators. And so I think the people I've worked with, and Scott, you in particular, really propel some of these projects in ways that otherwise wouldn't be possible. So for those of you who are maybe undergraduates or graduate students thinking about a career in academia, your colleagues will make this the most wonderful experience possible. And Scott is a perfect example of that. So I'm really, really grateful, and I wish that it had been different circumstances and we could have been here in person. I will also say that Scott's introduction to this and focusing on 2 declines actually in particular explains why someone who works on late antiquity and spends the better part of I don't know, graduate school for sure, like scorning any attention to the Roman Republic at all, why someone like that would turn to the Roman Republic. Because as a Roman historian, and I've been doing this now for 20 years, in those 20 years, there's been a really profound shift in the way people think about Rome and why Rome matters. When I started teaching, the Republic was something that was interesting, but not vital. It was the kind of thing that you studied, but you didn't expect you would learn about your world from looking at the Republic and its collapse. It was, you know, it was intriguing because the personalities were big and exciting, but it wasn't relevant. The empire was relevant. And if we think back to 2003, we think back to some of the things like Colin Murphy's, you know, Are We Rome? The focus then, as we led up to the Iraq War and struggled with the invasion of Afghanistan, was, are we the Roman Empire? Is the United States too big? Has it expanded too far? Right around 2012, I noticed a shift. My students started thinking that the empire was, you know, fun and interesting, but not relevant. They got really interested in the Republic. And that was what prompted me to begin thinking about the Republic. Because there's an obligation and a role that historians can play in conditioning people to think productively about the challenges that they face in their world. And the Republic, the Roman Republic, gives us a set of tools that my students were asking for. They were asking for ways to think about the world around them. They weren't looking for answers. They were instead looking for ways to think, looking for examples they could work with, looking for ways to understand the world as it once was, so they could get a better idea of what the world they lived in now could become. And so that was what prompted Mortal Republic, a sense that there was something new in how we were thinking about Rome and how we were thinking about Rome's relevance to our world. So today I want to do two things. And first, I want to tell the story of how it is that Rome's Republic shifted from a responsive representative democracy into a failed state that required an autocrat to stabilize its affairs. But the second thing I think is in some ways just as or even more important. I want to talk about the role that historians can play in using the past to inform conversations about the present, because both of these things are related. The Roman Republic allows us to see why the combination of an economic revolution, rapidly growing wealth inequality, and complacency can prove so destabilizing in a representative democracy. But it also highlights the limitations of seeing history as a kind of oracle that uncovers our future only if we can unlock the correct interpretation. And what we'll see is that Rome offers us a useful tool to think with, but it's a tool, and it's a tool we need to use carefully and responsibly, or it is a tool that we will basically render useless. But that's where I will end. I want to begin with the Roman Republic. And so when most people think of Rome, they think of it as the empire. And as Scott mentioned, this is, of course, what we all imagine. And when we think about Rome's fall, the story we turn to is Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. It's important to note that before Gibbon, the story that everyone told was about the decline of the Republic. This is the story that Machiavelli told. This is the story that Montesquieu told. This is the story that Biondo told. This is the story that people told until Gibbon shifted things forward and said, wait, the empire is redeemable. And Gibbon had his reasons for doing that we can talk about later. But before Rome was an empire, it was a republic. It was a republic in which citizens elected representatives to make and implement policy. And this is a quote we'll come back to, but I just want to put it up here because Romans understood that their republic was special. And when the Republic functioned at its best, it worked on the principle that every action needed to be taken on the basis of consensus. And so Romans understood this, and their investment in the political choices of their state allowed the Roman Republic to endure for 500 years. So this is now, we're not even halfway there in our Republic. Now, the Republic began as the government of a small city-state that was probably smaller than the city of Houston. When it died, the Republic controlled territory that was nearly the entire Mediterranean, an area about the size of the United States. So this is one of my favorite maps of all time. It overlays the Roman Empire on the United States. You get a sense of what we're talking about. If the Roman empire at the turn of the first century existed, now it would be something like the fourth largest country in the world. Perhaps a quarter of the entire population alive in the world lived under Roman control during the reign of Augustus. And much of the expansion that led Rome to become a Mediterranean-wide empire occurred after Rome's great victory over the Carthaginian general Hannibal. So when the war with Hannibal broke out, Hannibal shocked the Romans by marching out of his base in Spain, crossing the Alps and invading Italy. And once he was in Italy, Hannibal won a series of 3 quick military victories in 218, 217, and 216 BC. Perhaps 100,000 Roman soldiers died in those years. And this seems like an abstraction, but to put this into perspective, those soldiers, those Roman soldiers, the number of Roman soldiers that died in just those 3 years is greater than the number of Americans who've been killed in combat since the end of World War II. And this is despite the fact that the United States population is now nearly 80 times as large as that of Rome in the 3rd century BC. So by 216 BC, Hannibal was a day's march from the city of Rome. And it was at this moment that the Republic showed its most important strength, because that 100,000 dead was perhaps 35% of the fighting age population of the Roman Republic. Rome at that time had a relatively primitive economy that these defeats had nearly bankrupted. Its commercial networks were hugely disrupted. Its food supplies were threatened, and it faced revolts by many of its Italian allies that suddenly transformed a politically unified Italian peninsula into a patchwork of allied and adversarial city-states. But Rome nevertheless resolved to confront Hannibal, not to fold. And so Romans flocked to assemblies. They voted on commanders, and they endorsed policies that ensured that Rome would fight until Hannibal was defeated. And Romans and the men that they elected to represent them then embarked on a military and economic mobilization unlike anything the ancient world had ever seen. Fully 70% of the remaining Roman men of military age enlisted in the army. Troops were sent to fight in Spain, France, Croatia, Albania, Greece, Tunisia, and Algeria. The Roman economy shifted to one in which civilian needs were deliberately not met so that war material could be produced. Wealthy people surrendered their family jewels and accepted draconian sumptuary laws that prevented them from accumulating or flaunting wealth during this time of crisis. And for almost 15 years, Romans lived this way. The civilian population willingly endured food and material shortages, as well as the death and destruction inflicted by Hannibal's army that remained in Italy for more than 15 years. But Romans remained resolutely supportive of their decision to fight on, and the Republic ensured this. And that slide disappeared. And part of why the Republic is so special in ensuring this is because, unlike classical Athens, Rome was not a democracy. It's a republic. And this difference is important because in Athens, every citizen would get together, all votes counted equally, there would be a debate, they would vote by putting their hands up. And in the end, Athenian democracy showed quite visibly that everyone's vote mattered equally and policy could be changed very quickly. But Rome did not work that way. Rome deliberately made it so that not all votes counted equally. And voters did not decide policy on their own. They elected representatives to propose policies, to make policies, and to implement those policies. And so voters would approve those decisions or laws, but those laws or decisions needed to be proposed by a magistrate who was elected. And so the Roman Republic also worked on the principle that every action needed to be taken on the basis of consensus. And so now we come back to the Ciceronian quote. The Republic is the property of the people. And the people is not a collection of humans assembled in any old way, but a collection of a multitude joined to one another by a consensus about law and the common good. Now, this is a summation, I think, in a very basic way of what the Republic actually is. It's a group of people who come together and are governed by consensus. Not uniformity, but consensus, compromise, discussion. But once that consensus is reached, something very important happens. Consensus is reached in such a way that, unlike in a democracy where 51% of the vote can dominate 49% of people who are resolutely opposed to it, consensus binds a large portion of the population to a policy. And when they're bound to it, they own its outcome. And so Romans understood this. They understood when they collectively decided to fight until they defeated Hannibal, that meant that they owned that outcome and they owned the need to maintain that war until it was successful. And this resolution is admirable, but as Americans well know, a republic that has that kind of resolution and begins fighting around the world often finds it hard to pull back after the war ends. And so over the 50 years after Hannibal's defeat in 202, Rome tried and failed to withdraw troops from around the Mediterranean, including from places like Greece and Asia Minor. And each time Rome withdrew, it got forced to come back. So in Greece, it got forced to come back 3 more times. And each time it came back to fight in an area, the terms it inflicted on the defeated became harsher until one by one, Rome's enemies lost their independence. And by the 130s, Rome found itself holding lands that spanned 3 continents. The Republic now had an empire. And the Republic hesitated to build a large government bureaucracy to administer these territories. Now that would come, but only under the emperors, because the Republic instead decided to follow a good small government model, something that maybe Texans appreciate. And with that small government model, the administration of the provinces was contracted out to basically investors. Investors bid on contracts to collect taxes, to run the mines, and to do all sorts of other things that made the Republic's empire work. The way that these bidding competitions worked is investors were required to pay the full cost of the contract up front. And as the economic historian Philip Kay has shown, this arrangement inadvertently spurred a financial revolution in Rome. Now we can understand the logic here. The Republic, of course, just wanted a fixed sum. It wanted to know how much money was coming in from taxes from Asia or mines in Spain. And once it had a fixed sum, it didn't really care what happened next. But investors would bid on this, and then they would go out and they would do their best to not just recover what they did, but to recover something in excess of it, and that would be their profit. Now, no bidder had the cash on hand to cover something as large as the mining revenues of Spain or the tax burden of Asia. And so what they did was they took out loans to cover their cost. And the loans would be paid back following the end of the contract. And what the Romans, though, realized is that these loans could be assessed a value based on the likelihood the loan would be repaid and the amount of profit that was likely to be generated. The Roman innovation was to see that once you had a value for a loan, you could sell it. You could set a price for the resale of the loans because these loans now had a calculable value. And so reselling the loan would recapitalize the lender. He could then make another loan, which he could then again sell to generate more investment capital. This process quite literally created money, not coined money, but financial instruments with a monetary value. Until very recently, historians have been hesitant to credit the Roman economy with this type of sophistication, because the old economic model held that the Roman economy was effectively stagnant because nearly all wealth was tied to land holdings. But this is certainly wrong. And there's abundant evidence demonstrating that not only were financial instruments a huge component of the Roman economy, but they continued to be a huge component of the Roman economy for centuries. So we can see this in a number of ways. First, there are clear moments where political disruptions produce economic shocks like the 2008 crisis of confidence in financial instruments in the United States. So in the early 80s BC, for example, the massacre of a large number of Roman merchants and business people in Asia Minor sparked a financial crisis because the loans backed by their persons could no longer be collected. What this means, in essence, is those loans that have gone through the Roman economy multiple times, right? The person takes a loan out. That loan is then sold by the initial lender to someone else. It then forms the kind of basis of a financial instrument that somebody else uses as collateral for another loan. These loans bounce through the Roman economy many, many times. And when the guy who is the originator of that loan is dead, those loans suddenly have no value. And so what happens is all of the money generated by these loans bouncing through the economy is immediately destroyed. There's a capital crisis. And the large-scale destruction of capital dramatically and suddenly constricted the money supply in Rome. And what follows is remarkable, because the Republic mints some of the largest ever issues of denarii, a 4-gram effectively pure silver coin. And it does this in order to inject money back into the Roman economy. And this was fiscal stimulus. The Romans then understood the nature of their financial system and how to stabilize it in a crisis. But what's also interesting about this is not only did they understand this, they planned for it. Because Rome retained large amounts of raw silver that it could quickly coin as a mechanism to inject money into the economy during a panic. And so Rome clearly understood what financial instruments were, what a capital crunch could become, how it could happen, and how the state could respond. And it maintained the ability to respond by maintaining this raw silver that it could quickly inject into the economy. Something similar happens in 49 BC when Julius Caesar invaded Italy. Now, Caesar too faced panic as Romans feared that in a moment of political violence, he might destroy either wealth by abolishing debts or by killing the men who owed debts. And Caesar then does two interesting things that shows that he too understood the dynamics of the Roman financial system. So first, he publishes the pardoning of his opponents in the Civil War. This is an interesting point. We don't read this as a financial step, and it isn't entirely a financial step, but it is partially a financial step. Because what Caesar is saying is, I will not kill these people. And by saying, I will not kill these people, he's also saying their loans remain good. And so unlike the murder of all the business people in the 80s in Asia Minor, which destroyed capital by destroying the people who owe the money, Caesar commits to not destroying those people and therefore not destroying the capital that's tied to them. But another thing that's interesting is while he's doing this, Caesar also forbids people from taking large amounts of gold and silver out of Italy, just in case. And this communicated a respect for the lives and property of the people whose debts upheld the financial sector, while also indicating that there would be no capital flight. But this isn't all that Caesar does. Caesar also issues probably the largest coin issue in the entire history of the Roman Republic. It's this coin. This is a very famous coin, the Caesar elephant coin. And this is a coin that is issued because he is, again, stimulating, it's fiscal stimulus. He is stimulating the financial system by injecting coined raw silver into the economy in such a way that it, again, stabilizes any concern about the destruction of wealth. So this shows that Romans understood the nature of their finance system and the state understood how to respond to a financial panic. But as we move later in time, what we see is Rome not only had the capacity to respond to a crisis, but the government actually used financial instruments in a very sophisticated way to fund social programs. So the clearest example of this comes not from the Republic, but from the Empire. And this is the Alimenta scheme that's pioneered by the emperors Nerva and Trajan. Now, the Alimenta scheme is something that people kind of know in the background, and probably the images are more famous than the scheme itself. But the Alimenta is an imperially financed system through which individual cities provided food aid, education, and other forms of social welfare to their citizens. But what's seldom understood is how Trajan actually worked the Alimenta program, because he worked it in such a way that it not only provided resources to the poor, it also provided fiscal stimulus at the high end of the local economy. So the Alimenta scheme was set up so that cities were not obliged to participate in the program. They became eligible for it only if a critical mass of wealthy citizens decided to participate. But once enough people in the city decided that they were interested in participating in the program, Trajan then issued loans to the wealthiest figures in the city on which the borrowers paid a below market rate of interest. The borrowers then in turn invested the money the emperor loaned them in their cities, likely generating profits that could be used to benefit their home cities. And then the annual interest payments made to the treasury provided the funds that supported poor parents and children. And so the entire program worked not off of funds coming annually from the imperial budget, but off of the offering and reselling of loans. This is a program totally driven by financial instruments. And when we look at Pliny's letters, it's pretty clear that Pliny is trying to implement a program like this in Asia Minor as well. So this is probably not just in Italy. This is something much bigger. So what does this mean in the Republic? Well, what we can see is the revolution in finance reshapes what it means to be wealthy in Rome. And we can see this by comparing the investment portfolios and the amount of money available to the wealthiest Romans over basically a 120-year span. So the richest man in Rome in 190 BC was this guy, Scipio Africanus, the person who won the war over Hannibal. And his net worth in 190 BC is 700,000 denarii. pretty big amount of money, but it is literally 700,000 denarii because his fortune was held almost entirely in cash and property. He was a rich man in a primitive economy who could touch nearly all of his wealth if he wanted to. And the financial revolution changed this. The richest man in 70 BC is Crassus. Crassus's fortune was 42.6 million denarii, 60 times the size of Scipio's fortune. And very little of it would have been in cash. Instead, in fact, actually, it would have been impossible for it to be in cash because Crassus's holdings, if they were in cash, would have weighed more than 175 tons. That's more than all of the coined silver in the Roman economy at the time. So instead of a pile of coins, Crassus owned a remarkably diverse investment portfolio. So we know he lent money to tax collectors, to people engaged in commerce, and even Julius Caesar, funding his political campaign. He bought other loans and he owned extensive farms and agricultural properties. And Crassus also had a major stake in apartment buildings around the city of Rome. This is a famous story about Crassus. So the city of Rome had grown up really dramatically from probably 200,000 people at the time of the victory over Hannibal to nearly 1 million by the time Crassus is operating. And it grew very quickly and the building projects were not of the highest quality. And so Crassus took it upon himself to flip properties. And he had a staff of 500 engineers, architects, and craftsmen who could help him do this. And they took a particular interest in buying burned out, or in some cases, actively burning buildings that they would then buy and rebuild at a profit. Now, the new wealth that grew out of Rome's economic expansion was not equally distributed among Romans. It concentrated around people like Crassus. It concentrated around people like Crassus who understood how to take advantage of an economy that was now all of a sudden based around finance. This is, of course, something that sounds pretty familiar to us. And so some people like Crassus benefited far, far more than most people, and their riches fueled a rise in conspicuous consumption. So grand villas are constructed along main roads and seasides. Lavish dinner parties are held that feature dishes like ostrich steaks and flamingo tongues. And stories begin to circulate about what these nouveau riche people are actually doing. Some of the stories say that they would do things like take pearls and dissolve them in vinegar and then drink them as cocktails, just so that they could literally drink their wealth away. The thing is, many of the people who could do this sort of thing or who did this sort of thing could afford to do this sort of thing. And many of them got this wealth legally. And this is a problem because these displays of wealth occurred while Rome's middle classes saw its economic prospects stagnate. The first half of the 2nd century BC was a very remarkable time in Roman history because it had seen both the Roman rich and the Roman middle class do well. Kind of like Europe after World War II, Italy needed to rebuild its population and its infrastructure after the devastating war with Hannibal. And the first 2 generations after 200 BC had lots of opportunities to get land cheaply, to build markets for their products, and to find work in the growing cities of the Italian peninsula. But the economic tide had stopped lifting everybody's boats by the 140s BC. The Roman rich continued to get richer. They continued to use financial instruments and other elements of this new economy to get spectacularly wealthy. But with Italy now rebuilt and repopulated, the opportunities for poorer Romans began to dry up. And this is particularly striking because it comes after 2 generations in which children could expect to be richer than their parents. But by the 140s, the Romans coming of age and looking for opportunities began to realize that in all likelihood, they would not be richer than their parents. The opportunities that their parents had taken for granted no longer were there. Now, they would not be starving, but they wouldn't do as well as they hoped. And in some ways, that's worse because there is an expectation as they're growing up that they will have opportunities to continue to do better than their parents. And when those opportunities are not realized, people get angry. And these Romans knew that the wealthy continued to get richer while their opportunities were getting more and more constricted. They could see the villas of the rich. They could hear the stories of their wasteful spending, and they felt angry. And the Republic really struggled to respond. We see a series of half measures across the 140s as Roman politicians try to figure out how they can expand opportunities for these middle class and poor Romans. So they talk about sending Romans out as colonists to new lands captured in places like Liguria in northern Italy. They propose tweaks to the laws allowing people to rent public land to farm. The popular discontent was rising too quickly for the Republic's slow, deliberate, and consensus-based political process to keep up. And so writing nearly a century later, Cicero would say that a republic, again, this is our quote, is an entity of the people, but the people are not a collection of humans assembled in an old way. It's a collection of a multitude brought together by consensus about law and the common good. I want to focus here on law and the common good, because this is the key problem the Republic struggled with in the 140s. The issue in the 140s is, how do you uphold both law and a commitment to the common good? Because the Roman super rich had become rich lawfully, and the just exercise of law should have protected the wealth that they had legally acquired. That's what law does. But the common good suggested something different. Romans largely did not believe that this level of wealth, regardless of the legality under which it was acquired, was good for the Republic. And so steps to enhance the common good by addressing inequality would very likely undermine the rule of law unless the rich agreed to them. And steps to protect the property of the wealthy would seem just only if there was a broad agreement that they were for the good of the people. And so consensus could lead Rome out of this tension. But consensus takes time to develop in a representative democracy. And by the end of the 140s, Rome had not reached that consensus. And so as the 130s dawned, a new generation of Roman politicians come of age, and they saw political opportunity in this popular discontent. And so they began championing a series of voting right laws that makes it possible for Romans to vote by secret ballot. And here are a couple of Roman coins that actually show how voting worked. So we know, for example, from this denarius of Nerva on the top, that Romans voted in this period by walking along a narrow plank and dropping their ballots in a basket. This is how they would vote for laws or in elections. This coin of Longinus actually shows a vote for a law. And the U on there is I think, ubi rogas, I think, but it basically represents a vote in favor of the law. So this is a voter voting for a law and dropping the ballot with the V in the basket. And then there was another one that you would drop if you were voting no. This is how voting actually functioned. We actually can see kind of action shots of voting on these coins. This is secret ballot voting, though. Before the 130s, voting did not take place this way. Voting instead took place by somebody going forward and announcing their vote, which meant that there were all sorts of pressures on you to do this because it was identifiable what you were saying. With the secret ballot, now all of a sudden people were liberated to vote for things that, say, their patrons or their parents might not support. And with secret balloting possible, populists began pushing for economic reforms. The most prominent was a man named Tiberius Gracchus, who's a member of an elite family. And Tiberius won election to the office of tribune of the plebs in 133 BC, pushing an agenda of addressing this economic situation in a way that would advantage the lower and middle classes. Now, the tribunate gave its holder the ability to propose laws to one of Rome's assemblies. And Tiberius hoped to use his position to restart a political career that had become stalled. Now, Tiberius was a reformer, but Tiberius was not particularly interested in actually fixing the problems he was addressing. What he was instead motivated to do was enhance his own career. And so on the one hand, when we look at Tiberius's actual policy proposals, they're pretty moderate. His policy proposal to address economic inequality and wealth inequality in Italy was to basically take public lands that wealthy farmers were renting in excess of a limit that had been set in 367 BC, but not observed recently, and basically take that land from the renters, compensate them for it, and give poor Romans that excess land. This is not a radical proposal. It's in fact a proposal that wouldn't do much of anything to solve the problem. If he redistributed all public lands in Italy full stop, it's estimated that maybe this gives enough farmland for 15,000 families in a population of probably 4 million people. This is not much, but it actually doesn't matter how much it is, because what Tiberius Gracchus is doing is instead advocating in an angry way for people who feel disenfranchised. And so when Tiberius floats this policy, he's actually not even the first one to propose this. This was proposed in 139 by a consul, and it failed because there wasn't enough elite support for it. But Tiberius didn't care that there wasn't consensus for this. In the past, a Roman politician who didn't have consensus would withdraw the proposal when its failure became clear. But Tiberius instead brought together crowds of angry supporters, used them to depose a magistrate who opposed the plan, and then he redirected public funds to pay for the surveyors his plan required. None of these moves were illegal, but they were unprecedented, and more importantly, Tiberius had substituted threats and intimidation for the Republic's process of compromise and consensus. And Tiberius then announced that he was planning to run for re-election to a tribune that Romans usually only held once. That too was not illegal, but it hadn't been done since the 360s. It was not something that happened very often. Why did Tiberius do this? Well, Tiberius did this in short because it was good politics. It wasn't good policy. It wasn't going to change the economic dynamics, but it was something where Tiberius could use his failures to actually build increasing support for himself. And so Tiberius saw economic inequality as a way to kind of create a wedge in Roman society, and then he could exploit the dynamics that that wedge created. But he was willing to do this by using threats and intimidation. Now, to be fair, Tiberius never used physical violence to push through his laws. He never used physical violence to back his election campaigns, but he did use intimidation. He did use squads of scary people. He did use mobs and angry people yelling in support of him. And these actions alarmed his opponents so much that they feared that he would eventually resort to violence. And so they thought, because he might use this violence to even take over the Roman state, they needed to block Tiberius before he fell into this violent action. And so, led by Tiberius's cousin, Scipio Nasica, a mob of senators armed some of their own supporters and attacked Tiberius while voting was underway. And he and a number of his backers were killed. Now, this was the first act of political violence in Rome in over 300 years. And Romans desperately wanted to believe that this was an aberration, but it wasn't. The effects of Tiberius's murder resonated deeply. So we see, for example, historians write about this as a moment when the Republic no longer existed, but had been supplanted by force and violence. Cicero would agree with this. Cicero would go on and say that once you get to this point, you are in a situation where violence now is governing the Republic. And so Cicero says that the habit of lawlessness initiated by Tiberius Gracchus began to spread and changes our rule from one of justice to one of force. And what this means is it means that we ought to be anxious for our descendants and for the immortality of our Republic, because it's capable of lasting forever, but only if we maintain the customs that made it great in the first place. Cicero's ominous assessments hinted at what the next century of Roman life would look like. Romans would learn that the eradication of political violence, once it's in a political system, can prove stubbornly difficult. And this is particularly true when the violence existed amidst massive and growing wealth inequality that a republic never manages to effectively address. So disputes about land reform that Tiberius Gracchus brought into the conversation still loom over political conflicts that turned violent in the 120s and the 100s BC. Property confiscations and the redistribution of wealth accompanied the Roman civil wars of the 80s BC and the 40s BC. Promises of debt relief fueled the failed uprising of Catiline in 63 BC. And Julius Caesar, as we mentioned earlier, faced down similar calls made by Roman crowds to get rid of debt and redistribute land while he fought a civil war in the early 40s BC. But the biggest problem that Rome faced in the Republic's violent final century was a belief that the Republican structure remained sound despite massive inequality and occasional political violence. And so Cicero at one point argued that the Republic could last forever if it remained governed by law and if it remained something that its citizens vigorously administered. And so while Cicero is living in the 50s and seeing the Republic as a beautiful painting whose colors were beginning to fade, even Cicero took its survival for granted, because he once wrote that nothing is more destructive to civilizations, nothing contrary to law and justice, than governing through violence in a republic. But even Cicero condoned political violence when it benefited him. And so Cicero famously violated Roman custom by executing Romans without trial in 63 BC. And in 52, he penned a speech defending the vigilante murder of his hated political rival, Clodius. The murder was necessary, Cicero said, because Clodius was a man whom we are unable to restrain by any laws or any judicial proceedings. Maybe, I mean, maybe that's true. Clodius was a difficult person. But in the emotion of the moment, Cicero had walked away from his own commitment to nonviolent, lawful Republican government. And this is remarkable because Cicero is the most systematic and eloquent Roman political theorist to put pen to papyrus in the Republic. And even he was willing to bet that the vitality of the Roman Republic would allow it to withstand episodic political violence directed against people that Cicero despised. And Cicero was clearly wrong to think this. This position is much more, has much more integrity and creates a much more lasting republic than that position. Because before Cicero finished the work in his most powerful warning, in the work in which his most powerful warning about governing through violence appeared, soldiers loyal to Mark Antony and the future Emperor Augustus arrested him. They hung his head and his hands on the speaker's platform in the Roman Forum, and they used this as a terrifying emblem of a violent and fearful Rome that clearly was no longer a republic, and it never would be again. Now we know this is the end of the story. The Republic fell and an autocracy replaced it. But where did the complacency that made this possible come from? Why did someone like Cicero feel that it was okay to go back on this fundamental principle of what a republic was? Well, I think the answer lies in the simple fact that the Roman Republic took a very long time to die, and the crises that killed it were spread out considerably. We know this is one story. When we give these lectures in our classes, it's very frequent to go from Tiberius Gracchus to Augustus in one lecture, right? The collapse of the Republic. It's 90 years. It's a very long time. And the average Roman lived to be about 50 years old if they made it out of infancy. And so what that meant is they likely saw only one or perhaps two serious political crises in their adult lives. And Romans with this sort of life experience could be forgiven for thinking that the Republic was again strong when the crisis they experienced had ebbed. But the slow pace of Rome's political degeneration didn't mean there was no degeneration. It just meant that Romans failed to recognize the danger, and their failure bred a fatal complacency. Because as Cicero suggests, where is that slide? As Cicero suggests, the Republic was something that could die, and it did die, but Romans didn't imagine this. And so when we think about this, what we have to understand is no single person or choice destroyed the Roman Republic. The Roman Republic was much too robust for that. But the individual Romans who chose not to punish political obstruction, reckless populism, and intimidation steadily eroded the Republic's integrity. And robbed of its institutional defenses, the Republic could not prevent Rome's descent into civil war in the 40s or stop the emergence of a Roman autocracy at the end of the 30s. So where does that leave us? Because many of the conditions that set up the demise of the Roman Republic are present in our world. We too are living at a time when a gap has opened between the wealthiest people in the West and those in the middle class. Frustration is rising. Populists who embrace intimidation and who violate longstanding political norms are appearing around the world. Political violence is even emerging, even in our own country. And Rome shows us that these threats to representative democracy are real and they're very serious. But history is not destiny, and this presents historians with both a challenge and an opportunity. So first, the challenge. Rome is, of course, a very different society from ours in many, many ways. Communication moved much more slowly in Rome than in the modern world. Women could not vote. Voting was done in person in Rome, in the city of Rome, which meant that many of the 6 million citizens of the Roman state in the late Republic never voted in a Roman election and never imagined that they would. And disease was everywhere. So much so that a pandemic like COVID-19 would not have even registered in a city like Rome, where the death rate far exceeded the birth rate every single year for centuries. So we're not Rome. And once that's established, it's hard to get a non-historian to appreciate the lessons of the past without falling into the trap of thinking that history is repeating itself. But that doesn't mean that we should stop using the past to understand the present. So we may not be Rome, but Rome's republic does have important lessons to teach us. First, Roman history suggests that mature, established republics like ours take time to fail. They don't collapse quickly, but instead they often gradually succumb to cycles of crises that last a very long time. And so this means we should not necessarily see our current moment as a sudden and acute crisis. It's instead another manifestation of a long-standing political problem. After the death of Tiberius Gracchus, the later Roman Republic experienced violent political conflict roughly once or twice a generation. We now see this as a long process of degeneration, but the people living through these moments of conflict saw them as isolated events where a normal returned after they erupted. It took more than half a century for people like Cicero to see that the actions of Tiberius Gracchus had catalyzed a decades-long political crisis. And even then, Cicero and many Romans like him looked away when it was convenient to do so, as we saw with Cicero's condoning of the murder of Clodius. So we can learn from them, from Cicero and others, that the vigilant protection of norms is necessary at all times, not just when our side of the political divide is being wronged, but perhaps more importantly, even when our opponents are being attacked by people that we support. The Roman experience also suggests that we step back and take a longer view of our recent history. When did the crisis in American democracy actually begin? So journalists like Michael Tomasky place its roots in the 1980s with the rise of Rush Limbaugh, the televised antics of Newt Gingrich, and the demise of the Fairness Doctrine, a set of things that inaugurated the era of performative partisanship. But one could just as easily push the timeline back to the 1960s and see our conflicts now arising from unresolved, persistent issues of racism, political violence, and disenfranchisement. And one of my colleagues, Mark Hendrickson, who's an economic historian of the US, has even mentioned to me that the relatively equal wealth distribution of the post-war economy in the United States is beginning to look so anomalous that we may eventually come to see this as a temporary blip that obscured the fundamental inequality of an industrialized America. And if this is true, Romans would understand, because they had their own half-century blip when all boats rose together after Hannibal's defeat. And nothing quite like that occurred again in the 15 subsequent centuries of Roman history. So Rome then suggests that our historical lens needs to be bigger to appreciate the dynamics of this moment. Historians know this, but non-historians often do not, and this can have really serious consequences. So to take a recent very public discussion by historians, how do we understand Donald Trump? If the public imagines that Donald Trump aspired to be a 1930s era tyrant, and we use the examples of Hitler and Mussolini to try to understand him, they may also think that the current situation in which we live in will either overwhelm us very quickly, as it did in, say, Italy in the 1920s or Germany in the 1930s, or it will just dissipate in a few years. And so this means that whatever happens next, people will assume that a phase of our history has finished in the next few years. And then they'll turn their attention elsewhere, like Romans did. But this is the mistake that so many millions of Romans made in the first century BC. It's what made them relax their vigilance when their republic seemed to be healthy, when the crisis seemed to have passed. Even Cicero, who should have known better, fell victim to this. And so Rome shows where complacency leads. It shows us the need to fight for our republic if it's something that we value. And it shows us the need to fight for that republic in a principled way. And historians can help us do this by expanding the examples and tools we use to think through the possible contours of a future society created by the choices we make in the present. History can fuel our imagination. It can spur our creativity. It can help us recognize serious problems when they're just emerging, and it can help us devise possible paths to solve them. And so this means that historians have a vital role to play in the conversations we are now having about racial injustice, political crisis, economic inequality, pandemic response, and so many of the other profoundly disconcerting issues that are confronting us all at the same time at this moment. And the public needs our input. but we need to be responsible in how we intervene in these conversations. People want us to show direct correlation between the past and the present, so that they can understand the current moment and project the future. And we need to resist this. We need to resist the urge to promise more than we can deliver. We can use the past to help people understand the present, and we can provide them with tools to imagine futures that may come about. That's our role. It's what we've always done. It's what we've done since Herodotus and Thucydides. It's something we do well, so we should lean into it. We should explain what historians can and can't do. And let's help our fellow citizens more fully understand their world, so together we can use the past to imagine and create a better future. Thank you.
Great, Ed. Thank you so much. Wonderful talk. It gives us a lot to think about and I hope talk about. I'll give you a second. Yes, you can take a sip and kind of. We do have 2 questions now in the Q&A. Okay. So Ed, I will leave that to you to access those and respond to those. And whoever else again would like to ask a question, please do so there. The Q&A function at the bottom of the screen.
Okay, so the question is, one sign that's been an almost ubiquitous sign of future failure across the fall of empires and republics is an inability to protect allies. I don't want to sound anachronistic, but one sees many parallels between the Roman Republic and the current American Empire. Despite victory for Rome in the Second Punic War, Rome failed to protect its ally Saguntum from imminent disaster at the hands of Hannibal's armies, just as the United States has failed to protect those it vowed to protect in Afghanistan from the grip of the Taliban. How should we view various Roman military successes, whether it be the defeat of the Carthaginians in the Second Punic War or the expansion of the Roman Empire due to Trajan's successful Parthian War, which was somewhat mitigated by revolts throughout the eastern portion of the empire, when they came at such a high cost to the Republican Empire? Okay, so I guess it's very long, so I'm trying to discern what the specific question is. How should we view success when they come at high cost, I guess, is the core of that, and then the need to protect allies. I think that the situation with Saguntum is a very tricky one. And the ability of Rome to protect its allies, I think, varies from time to time. When we're talking about Roman allies, we really have a history that goes back for nearly 2,000 years. I mean, the way that Rome treats its allies varies dramatically depending on the moment that you are in, and the miscalculations or the calculations that Romans are making at that time. So I think the situation in Saguntum very clearly did have repercussions moving forward. And we actually see this when, for example, Hannibal and Fabius Maximus are courting allies during the Second Punic War. And Gallic allies basically tell the Romans, we know what happened with Saguntum and you couldn't protect your people. So why would we ally with you? And many of them do ally with Hannibal. So in the short term, there's a very clear implication. And it does hurt Roman alliance structures. It hurts Rome's ability to make new alliances. What hurts Rome's ability to maintain old alliances in the Second Punic War is that Rome keeps losing, and there's political dynamics in those individual cities that see it as advantageous to turn their back on Rome. So I think that perhaps one of the things that we can do is look at, say, the alliances, if we're using an American example, the Roman experience in the Second Punic War, which is one of the greatest failures of the Roman alliance structure. This might suggest that we have to view, say, allies in Afghanistan differently than we view, say, allies in South Korea or Germany. Long-standing alliances tend to last longer and be stronger than short-term alliances, and I think Rome shows this. But the bigger question of cost, some Roman military successes came at extremely high cost, others did not. So if we're looking even just in the reign of Trajan, the conquest of Dacia was expensive, but in the end, I think probably rewarding. The conquest of Arabia was extremely cheap and extremely rewarding. And the invasion of Parthia was a disaster. I think that Trajan's successful Parthian War in part looks successful because Trajan died before the thing blew up, and it was blowing up when Trajan died. So I think that when we're looking at that, the Parthian War really does show that a badly planned campaign, and generally speaking, if you're going to invade Iraq, you need to somehow secure the Zagros Mountains, or you're going to have rearguard actions coming out of Iran that you really cannot effectively combat. And so that was part of what undid Trajan. The Parthians just moved into the mountains and were able to basically organize without real significant pushback as a strong resistance to Trajan. So I would say that what we see there is that Rome did absorb really significant costs for some of its expansionary projects. In other contexts, it didn't. And the emperors and the generals that embark on these things in the empire are more willing to absorb costs than they are in the Republic. But if it's a defensive war, they are really willing to absorb costs in the Republic in ways that the empire probably would have found unsustainable. How do we not fall into complacency as citizens or residents of the United States, unlike Romans in the past? I think that one of the great challenges is, one of the great ways to address that challenge is to just acknowledge the fact that republics can end. We can't take things for granted. And what that means is when we see actions that we know are damaging to the political structure and damaging to the trust that we have in fellow citizens, we need to resist them. So, I think that when we look at what happened on January 6th and the way that this felt to many of us, and then we look at how this is now being reframed as something that really wasn't that bad, it wasn't that serious, it wasn't a coup attempt, and we see the kind of normalizing of some of these actions. This is exactly what Cicero was doing. Cicero understood what was the big picture issues that were facing the Roman Republic in the 50s. He spoke really eloquently and systematically about why they were big picture issues and what consequences would come out of it. But in the heat of the moment, Cicero abandoned those larger conceptual structures and instead became very kind of transactional. This one action benefits me, and so I'll carve that out of what I see as acceptable or unacceptable. We cannot become transactional. If we value a republic, there is no condition under which it's acceptable to storm the Capitol violently. Never, ever. That is not a Republican action. It doesn't matter if you're a Republican or a Democrat. That is not consistent with what a republic is supposed to be. Street fighting is not something that is ever consistent with what a republic is supposed to be. And I think one of the things that we can do to not fall into that complacency is say, wait, there is a line, and that line is not negotiable. There are certain things that cannot be part of a functional republic. Political violence is one of them. Intimidation is another one. Once we're policing that line, then I think we are not falling into the same kind of complacency that we see people in the Roman Republic falling into. But I think on the other hand, we can understand why Romans fell into that. And that's probably another lesson we can take away. Okay, Nicholas Soria. As a historian, how do you account for issues of scale when attempting to analyze and compare the events of different periods? For example, is the development of stasis in late Greek polis, the development of political violence in late Roman Republic, not obviously different, just in virtue of how many people were in the later? The same, of course, may go when comparing post-Punic War, post-Second Punic War Rome and post-World War II. As a non-historian, I struggle with this. So I think that the question of scale is an important one. And with the Roman Republic, one of the challenges is the citizen body is massive, but the decision-making is still occurring in Rome. And so a lot of the concerns of people who are outside of Rome have to channel through Rome. And one of the things that is particularly distorting about Roman political life in the 130s and the 120s down through the 90s is Italian allies participate in an Italian economy that's deeply integrated with the Roman economy. But politically, they do not have any say in how policies are being decided. And so one of the big issues that, say, Tiberius Gracchus's land reform faces is the land is being distributed, the land that is being taken away from people to hold land in excess of the legal amount is being distributed only to Roman citizens. But there are non-citizens who hold some of that land in excess of the legal amount. They do not have representation. And so when you're talking about scale in the Republic, one of the things that you see is there are a whole lot of people who in the latter part of the 2nd century are affected by Roman policies that are being sort of dragged into these demagogic arguments about how to respond to inequality, but they do not have a direct say in what those policies are or how those policies are implemented. As you move into the 1st century after the social war and these people get citizenship, then the problem becomes they can't get to Rome. And so it's an interesting thing because in a polis, especially a smaller polis, everybody can participate. In Athens, sometimes maybe it's a little hard to go from, I don't know, Sunion to come into the assembly every time. But if you're in a small city, you can participate. You cannot in the Roman Republic. But I think the Republic does a good job of saying, in essence, we are a representative democracy and your voice is channeled through a representative anyway. And so even if you can't participate all the time, this person is representing you anyway. And so in a way, it is creating a structure that kind of more resembles a modern state than an ancient polis, because it already has something in place for kind of scaling up these conversations. And incidentally, that's why the Roman Republic was so appealing to America's founding fathers, because it is a model that can continually scale up representative democracy as a state expands and as a citizen body expands. Diego, how would I categorize BLM and Antifa riots? I mean, I think generally speaking, the one very clear line that I would draw is that violence should never be part of democratic processes. And so anytime you have violence, you are doing something that is inherently dangerous for a political system. But, you know, public speech and making your opinions known and demonstrating that there is popular support for opinions, these are things that republics do count on and do require to function well. But I think the line that I would draw is the same line that in his more principled moments, Cicero would draw. There is no place for violence in a republic. It just doesn't go along with how a republic works, because a republic is in essence a legal contract for all citizens governed by consensus, and everybody's a stakeholder in it. What violence does is it short circuits that political process and it takes people out of that sort of contractual arrangement with each other. And so I think there's just no way that you can have a political system designed in a way a republic is that also has a violent component. Ted, I wonder whether the picture of class resentment is complicated by the fact that Rome was not just horizontally stratified into economic classes, but also vertically integrated in patronage structures. In other words, did Crassus's clients resent him for being so wealthy, or were they glad to have such a patron? This social integration would be one advantage Romans had that we don't. I don't have any billionaire patrons. I don't either have any billionaire patrons. I think that it's somewhat tricky because there are repeatedly across, I mean, this is true across nearly all of Roman history, there is a tension between your the social order that you belong to, which is in essence, you know, your patrician status or your status that comes from the prestige of previous generations, and your wealth, which doesn't always track. I mean, you do, of course, always have some patrician families that are very, very old and have been in Rome and elite structures for a very long time that are very wealthy and remain very wealthy, you know, into the empire. We see that there are a number of those. But you also see, for example, depending on how we view Roman tribal names as we get into the early republic, there's at least one school of thought that says the tribal names actually reflect, you know, people, prominent people that were sort of championing this group. And some of those families have disappeared. You know, we have no trace of them. Some of the tribes do seem to be probably connected to some of the family names of prominent people, but some of them aren't, and we don't know who those people were. When you look at things like the discussions of the sort of rapid economic growth in the 2nd century BC, we do see senatorial families kind of collapse because they cannot keep up economically. And so there is both an advantage when the social structure and the wealth structure tracks. But then there's also a tension when the social structure does not track with the wealth structure, because that actually is incredibly destabilizing. When you have somebody who comes from, who is not actually of sort of really prominent family, but gets to be really, really wealthy, they have abilities to distort a political structure in such a way that the old money people get really upset. There was an article, this is years ago, but this might be something that resonates with you, Scott, an article about Martha's Vineyard, where they were talking about the old money people in Martha's Vineyard resenting the tech billionaires who are showing up. And the old money people have social capital. They don't have money compared to the people who are showing up. And there's all kinds of tension that comes out of that, where you have one type of resource and not another type. And you're competing with somebody unequally because what you possess is, in a sense, good for a different game. It'd be like if you have a football helmet and a baseball bat and you try to play hockey, you know, like neither one of those is going to work very well. So I think that when we're talking about this, the social stratification and the economic stratification, when it tracks, makes someone incredibly powerful. When it doesn't track, it creates tension. And some of the people who are disadvantaged because they possess power and wealth, but not status, really, really struggle in ways that cause great damage to the republic. But when those things line up, you have somebody who's incredibly powerful. And one of the things that I think Augustus understood a great deal about Roman society when he was creating the empire, but one of the things he understood was how to basically control status in such a way that he could award it to people who otherwise wouldn't be able to participate in that level of kind of discourse and that level of political activity. And you look around the people who do best under Augustus, it's people like Agrippa who are not from prominent families, but he makes it so that they can do well. And he in a way blends status and wealth in a way that only he controls. And he creates a kind of monopoly of both things. That's a really important step in creating the imperial structure. Ted, that might be more than more detail than you wanted there.
So I see those are all the questions in the Q&A. I'll wait just another minute or so to see if anyone else wants to type one in. In the meantime, if I could just ask a quick question as well. There's this relationship in the narrative that you're creating, well, between norms and laws, right? And where norms really carry the greater weight in Rome, because of course ancient Rome didn't have a constitution, right? Obviously it had laws, but no constitution. So the violation of norms, as you were saying, is really, really vital. Of course, we do have a constitution, but I think we've seen where, in the American context, where laws and norms have a more complicated relationship than we might have thought maybe 2015 or so, right? So, yeah. So anyway, but do you think that this is another way to kind of differentiate ancient Rome from our current situation? But also, you know, do we have a kind of protection because we have the Constitution and the rule of law in ways that Rome doesn't, or do you feel it's more complicated and bound up with each other?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really wonderful question, because I think that the Constitution, there was an article I read not too long ago that says that in essence, one of the big problems we have right now is the Constitution is it's a living document, but it's a document that is not able to evolve. You know, because of the political paralysis we have right now, the Constitution is basically, I think this article said, a relic of sort of three big bursts of constitutional amendment activity, the last of which was sort of in the 60s and 70s. And so you get stuck with a document that really hasn't evolved at all in 50 years, and it becomes a kind of interpretive text instead of something that, you know, directly engages with issues that it needs to engage with. Roman norms are something that's kind of similar. And you see that there are things that are clearly supposed to be activities that are out of bounds in the Roman state. You know, for example, executing people without a trial. That is not supposed to happen in the Roman state. And after the murder of Tiberius Gracchus, there's a senatorial court that's convened. and it racks up a bunch of people who are associated with Tiberius Gracchus, and they get, I think a couple get executed. One of them, I think, gets thrown into a bag with like snakes and is thrown into the Tiber, but crazy kind of things. Gaius Gracchus, when he takes over, immediately passes a law saying like, that's messed up, it's not allowed. Because that was the Senate just acting on its own without the people saying that it should be done. And so you have there a constitutional crisis. But what happens is the guy who did it actually just leaves because he knows he's going to get in trouble and he knows there's a real problem and he kind of knows he violated something. The Senate, there's a great book by a guy named Straumann where he looks at the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, which our sources say is a very old thing, but he says like the first time you see it is Gaius Gracchus. And they invent a rationale for this that goes all the way back to people like Ahala, and you see these kinds of things, showing up in the 5th century BC, but that's clearly not what's going on there. And so you have this idea that there are established norms in the Republic, but they have to be legally grounded as well. Not in the way that we have a constitution, but we have, in a sense, almost kind of made into a sacred text that requires interpretation but doesn't evolve. The Romans also believed that there are sort of rules that govern these norms and laws that govern these norms. And, there are things that should not be done. And if there's a violation, then someone should be taken and held to account for it. But you're right that norms are a huge part of this. And part of that is because you cannot make a law for every possible thing that might happen because you can't imagine it. And in the Republic, there are lots of things that they would never have imagined could happen. They don't have laws against them. Like they don't have laws against Tiberius Gracchus because he just didn't simply do these things. They didn't think they needed a law that said you couldn't run for re-election as tribune because there was a huge standoff between 376 and 367 BC where tribunes basically refused to step down until they got access to higher offices. Once they got access to higher offices, people thought, well, okay, that's done. Tribunes now, they move on. That's what a tribune does. They serve once and then they move on to sort of be a praetor or something. So I think that would be, that might be the thing that you would say is the violation of norms in Rome, in many cases, come about because there's a kind of expectation that things will work in a certain way. The norm isn't explicitly, you cannot do X. It's just, wow, nobody has done X. Why would anyone even think to do X? We don't have a rule about that because why would we need one? So I think that that's another important component of it. And the same is true to a degree with our Constitution, where there are all kinds of things. Our Constitution hasn't been amended since the internet was invented. There's lots of things the Constitution should probably say about, behavior on the internet and speech on the internet and threats on the internet. But we don't have, we haven't had a proposed amendment that's been enacted since the internet was invented. And so the Constitution doesn't talk about it. You're interpreting it instead. Neil, okay, this is a great question. So did Rome have a court system and how could it have helped to stop some of the problems you mentioned? It did not have a court system. It had a jury system, but it did not have a system like we have. And this is actually, I think, one of the great lessons that our founders probably learned from Rome. There is no independent judiciary in the Roman Republic. And so there's no check on these kinds of behaviors. Instead, law can be used as a kind of cudgel in political disputes. And so if you want to tie up a political opponent, you can sue them. If you want to sort of spread rumors about somebody who might beat you in an election, you put together a kind of spurious lawsuit connected to something and it just muddies the water. There is no public prosecutor that will say that there's nothing there. There is no court system that will weigh in and say this kind of action violates law or violates custom or violates, Rome doesn't have a constitution, but violates the kind of established order, the established legal order of the Roman state. That didn't exist. And so it's actually a very important aspect of our constitutional system and our Republican system to have an independent judiciary so that prosecutions are not immediately tied up by politicians who are using them for political advantage. And that's one of the things that was particularly alarming in some of the things that leaked out in the last couple of years, when you have what's supposed to be an impartial judicial structure and impartial judges getting politicized. You're moving in the direction that the Romans were in the late Republic, and you're moving in a direction that our founders very clearly did not want us to go. Let's see if there's another question. Oh, there is. Cicero seems to think the execution of traitors without history has a long history in the Roman Republic and was therefore precedented and quite in keeping with the mos maiorum, or so I understand the first Catilinarian. Yeah, this is where Straumann's argument is really interesting, because what Straumann says is, Cicero probably did believe this, but this argument is something that really grows out of the stuff in the 2nd century BC. So you have examples in Livy that show a couple of moments like this. The most famous one is, I forget the name of the person Ahala kills, but Servius Ahala, who actually incidentally is a ancestor of Brutus. And so Servius Ahala is a person who is it's a complicated story and the accounts of it are not totally clear, but basically Ahala is entrusted by the Senate to go and deal with a guy named Manlius, who is kind of demagoguing in the forum. And Ahala ends up going to try to arrest Manlius, and it results in a kind of violent confrontation, and Ahala stabs him and kills him. And this is seen as an action kind of like the execution of people who are trying to overthrow the state. And so this gets sort of wrapped up in it gets wrapped up in the later Republican sort of myth making that govern things like the Senatus Consultum Ultimum. But what Straumann says is you don't really have good evidence of this existing before the 120s. And so Cicero, I'm sure, believed that there is a precedent for doing this. Caesar, of course, did not. And Caesar, of course, pointed to like where you go when you do these kinds of things. Where he points to Sulla and says, well, Sulla, the people he killed at first maybe deserved it, but the people he killed at the end certainly did not. And when you take citizens' rights away from them, you don't just take it away from the bad people, you take it away from everybody. And you cannot go in that direction. And it's a real argument that I think when we see the pushback by Gaius Gracchus and others, there isn't an effective senatorial response to what Gaius Gracchus is saying about those courts that are trying people simply for their association with Tiberius Gracchus. Instead, the Senate basically they can't stop it. They can't stop that law from being passed because it really was clearly felt that there was something wrong about how that had played out. And so I would agree with you about Cicero and what Cicero thought the mos maiorum was. Historically, though, I think that the evidence for what Cicero thought being actually true before about the 120s is pretty slight. And it seems to be kind of, polluted by the discourse that Cicero himself believes to be correct. To what degree do I find Caesar responsible for the end of the Republic? Oh, this is a great question. So I think Caesar's an incredibly complicated figure. I think, on one level, Caesar is very, very deeply committed to this principle that we just talked about, this principle of the rights of a citizen to be protected by the laws of the state. And Caesar very much does not want to do what Sulla did and kill his opponents. And I think Caesar understood the risk, and I think he was willing to absorb that risk because principally he did not feel that's what a republic should do. But is he responsible for the end of the Republic? Yeah, I think to a degree he is, but to a degree. And that qualification is important because when Caesar crosses the Rubicon, there's a couple things guiding him. One of them is like Plutarch kind of lays out, it's ambition. It's this like overwhelming, uncontrollable ambition. And that very clearly is Caesar's problem. It's his fault. He owns that. But why that ambition had to be channeled into crossing the Rubicon, that is not Caesar's fault. Because what you have are a couple of failings that I think make that decision comprehensible if you understand that Caesar is ambitious. The first issue is, whatever agreement Caesar is going to make with his opponents, the Republic no longer has the capacity to enforce. The legal protections that the Republic is able to provide to citizens by the early 40s, they exist only theoretically. Like, they exist if you don't ever really need to use them. So yeah, you're protected as a citizen, and no one will take your property, and no one will take your life without trial unless they feel like taking your property or your life without trial. And so the Republic has failed to restrain opponents from doing things like what Cicero does to the Catilinarians. And Caesar has every reason to believe, if he actually disarms and returns to Rome as a private citizen, and someone guarantees him something, there's no law that's actually going to protect him. Only his army is going to protect him. And his opponents generally, but Cato in particular, I think bear a lot of responsibility for that. So to what degree is Caesar personally responsible? I think Caesar's personally responsible to a great degree, but I think we can understand why Caesar does what he does. And I think that if you acknowledge that Caesar is ambitious, and most Romans of that rank are ambitious at that time, then we can say the Republic failed Caesar. But I think Caesar's overwhelming ambition made it so that that situation played out in exactly the way it did. So is he responsible? Yes, but the Republic is also responsible for its own death. It's a murder-suicide, I guess.
So it looks like those are all the questions, some excellent questions, and thank you for them, everyone. So perhaps we will end things there. I want to thank Ed certainly for a wonderful talk and a stimulating talk, and really a call to arms for all of us to read Roman history and apply Roman history judiciously.
Yes.
To our current moment. So thanks, Ed, very much, and thanks to everyone for tuning in. And yeah, I suppose that's it.
Well, thank you so much, Scott. Thank you, Christian. Thank you, everybody, for the great questions and the discussion. And yeah, I'm really glad we were able to do this. And do read Roman history.
All right, everyone, take care.